Good morning and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Paula. I'm also known as PB Morlen, author of the fantasy fiction, historical fiction, historical nonfiction books in the White Bird series. And I added that introduction to my books as an explanation that they're not just fantasy books, because in my understanding, most often in our world, we discover that some things that were once considered fantasy are not, but they are rather fact. Anyway, moving forward, I hope you're having a marvelous day. I know I am, and I just thought it would be a really good way to start my morning after I did my sun gazing and a quick morning meditation, which I always do as I welcome in the energies of the new day. I have different varying meditation methods that I use. I have been meditating for 20-30 years, and only in the last maybe 6 years have I made it a daily practice. And so I bring in the dragons, and I bring in all my aspects, of which I have 12. Everyone does, every organic human being on this planet. And these aspects are still in their own stories. So I have decided today to continue my story of Illuminating Crystal. A few episodes back, I introduced the book to you with a prologue, and then I began chapter 1. And I stopped reading midway because, first, I don't like my videos to go longer than a particular amount of time, just because I want to make sure that my readers can get a really good taste of these stories in little nuggets instead of one long drawn out video. That's how I like to do things. So I always interpret that if others are like me, that's how I want to deliver to them. So I'm going to continue reading right where I left off in part 2 from these stories from Illuminating Crystal. She has just been blown into the bookstore, as you recall, and there's an old man at the counter who's just dropped this book, and he's standing there mouth wide open because the girl is familiar to her. And so I'll just kind of read the last chapter that I left off with in part 2. She slowly, without taking his eyes off the girl who had just burst into his shop, he bent over to retrieve the book and watched the girl turn and stare at his door, shaking her head. She unwound her red scarf and removed her bulky mittens, tucking them into her coat pocket. With a narrow-eyed gaze, she removed her small black eyeglasses and began to wipe them with her red scarf. She looked away, and with a loud whoosh, he released his breath. He hadn't known he'd been holding it. The girl put her glasses back on, held her arms out stiffly in front of her, and waggled her fingers as she walked toward a chair. The old man's eyes widened in surprise when she sat down on Mr. Putman and his newspaper. The man in the chair choked out a yelp as he flew from his lap. "Crikey! I'm so sorry!" Her eyes were wide with surprise. The shopkeeper could see a rosy blush spread across her face from where he stood, and watched with growing alarm as the girl felt her way over to another occupied chair and stepped on a young man's toes. "Hey, watch it!" the boy cried as he pulled his feet in under his chair. "Bloody hell," she muttered with a hint of frustration. "Please excuse me. My glasses are fogged up and I can't see. Pardon me." With arms outstretched and eyes opened wide, she finally found an unoccupied chair, and with a small grunt of satisfaction, she sat down. She slipped off her little black loafers, which were completely inappropriate for the frigid outdoor temperatures and slush-filled sidewalks, and briskly rubbed her feet together while she chewed on her lip and searched her coat pockets. A A triumphant little smile lit up her face when she pulled out a tissue, and once again she removed her glasses and began to rub them with a fierce intensity. She certainly had made a commotion. The man, who had been watching the young woman abuse his customers, decided it was time to approach. He placed his hands firmly on his hips and attempted to look stern. Ahem. Excuse me, miss, he said. Were you looking for something in particular? She quickly slipped her feet into her shoes, stood up, put on her glasses, and looked down into his weathered face. He peered up at her owlishly through his spectacles. Then she flashed a quick, tentative smile. No, sir, I just came in for a minute to warm up. It's really cold out, and the wind literally blew me in. She shook her head and glanced with uncertainty at the front door. Well, young lady, he said, staring up at her with hands on hips, we don't like loiterers. You've bothered my customers enough for one day. If you've... Sorry. I get mixed. My screen goes up and down and I can't catch it in time. If you're not interested in any of my books, then, he was going to say, then be on your way. But he stopped when he saw the longing in her eyes as she gazed around the store. She looked around the shop and eyed the high ceilings and the heavy ornate light fixtures lining the top of the old wooden bookshelves. The wind had blown her into a very charming bookstore. What a glorious old place, she thought, breathing in deeply. Then she smiled. The mixture of smells was familiar. Musty old books and freshly printed new ones. Heaven. She forgot about her frozen feet and her fit of despair. Slowly, she walked over to a tall bookshelf. A warm feeling, long buried, began bubbling to the surface, and her toes tingled, but not from frostbite. She found herself reading the titles of some books she hadn't seen in years. Not since, she squeaked with delight, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Sense and Sensibility. She ran her fingers lovingly over the soft leather bindings, and her heart melted. This was the place. She wanted to work here. She turned to find the little white-haired man with his wire-rimmed glasses still standing, arms akimbo, still wearing a very stern look. She smiled and walked towards him. I wouldn't suppose you could use some help, she asked. I'm quite capable of handling myself, girl. Well, what I mean is, she pulled off her red cap and tried to look pleasant as she watched the old man's eyes widen. This often happened when people saw her hair. She was used to it. I'm looking for a job, and this bookstore has brought back some very fond memories. She found herself rushing through her words. I'm a very hard worker, and I really need a job. The old man looked at her sternly. I told you, I don't need any help. If you need a book, I got it. If you need a job, I don't. With a flip of his hand and a shake of his head, the old man returned to the counter on the far side of the shop. Well, she was not one to be turned away easily, especially now when she actually felt happy. It had been so long. She knew she'd have to convince the crabby old gentleman that he needed her. She wasn't leaving here without securing employment. She took a deep breath, straightened herself up, patted her hair, and squared her shoulders. Then she marched up to the counter that the old man had headed toward and rang the little silver bell. Ding! Ah! She gasped and jumped back when the old man popped up from behind the counter. You don't need to ring that thing when I'm right here, he scolded. She blinked. I'm very sorry. I didn't see you behind there. She reached over the counter, grabbed the old man's hand, and held on tight. He staggered back when an electric current, strong enough to make his hair stand up, sizzled up his arm. He quickly withdrew his hand. Are you all right? Her large eyes opened wide in surprise. He gripped the counter with both hands and nodded his head slowly. I'm fine. You just startled me. Well, I'm sorry about that. My name is Crystal, and... Your name is Crystal! She jumped again. With each word, his voice had raised an octave, and her name hung in the air like the echo of a bell's chime. 2 or 3 heads turned to see what all the commotion was about. Your name is Crystal? He asked, this time in a softer voice. Yes, Crystal Blue. I think we got off on the wrong foot. The old man's eyebrows raised and his mouth sagged open. Dude, are you okay? He shook his head and pushed his glasses up his nose. Then he indicated with a feeble fluster of his hand for her to continue. I'm sorry if you thought I was loitering in your store, she smiled and batted her long eyelashes at the old man. I never loiter in bookstores. I love them. I love everything about them. He grumbled. You see, mister. She waited patiently while the old man stared at her. His intense gaze made her slightly uncomfortable. He cocked his head to the side and pursed his lips. Name's Addis. Thrust his chin like he was challenging her. Mr. Cosmo Addis, and don't call me dude. Oh, okay. She flashed him another smile. You see, Mr. Addis, I can make myself very useful because I just love bookstores. I love everything about them. The way they smell, the way they sound, everything. She knew she was rambling, but the words spilled out of her mouth. Mr. Addis, you have a lovely store, and I'm sure you're well staffed. I've never seen such a well-stocked bookstore in my life. I just love the smell of the books, don't you? The smell always reminds me of my grandfather. Crystal looked around the shop, smiling. My grandfather, he always brought me along on the weekends when he went to the bookstore, his favorite place. She was surprised at herself for being so candid. She felt giddy. The thought of her grandfather and bookstores hadn't made her happy in a very long time. When I was a little girl, my grandfather would spend time with me every Saturday morning, Mr. Addis, and my grandmother would make us both a huge stack of pancakes. Do you like pancakes, Mr. Addis? He nodded his head slowly. Well, I just love pancakes, she gushed. My gran made the best. She claimed she was the best cook from County Clare. Crystal smiled as she thought of her fiery little grandmother. Then she leaned on her elbows and looked directly into the old man's befuddled face. He blinked and was mesmerized by her cat-like eyes that gently swept up at the corners. The honey-brown irises were flecked with gold and framed by lashes so long that when she blinked he swore they brushed the inside of the lenses of her small black glasses. The slender frames didn't distract but rather enhanced the exotic orbs. A tiny green gem sparkled brightly upon the side of her delicately upturned nose, and a small spray of freckles fanned out over her nose and her high cheekbones. He was enchanted, held prisoner by her wistful gaze. Crystal sighed and continued with her reverie. We'd eat our pancakes, Mr. Addis, and then my grandfather and I would hop into his silly old car and go to the Fionn Shigar bookstore in Anestiman. I'd be able to spend my whole Saturday mornings reading mysteries, romance novels, thrillers, you name it. It was heavenly. I haven't been into a bookstore for many years. Her eyes welled up and she sniffed. Well, my grandfather died a few years ago, and, well, I must admit, this shop reminds me of him. She blew her nose into the tissue that had been balled up in her hand, and she looked around the shop, hoping that she could spend more time in the charming place that had really stirred her up. She really felt happy. She hadn't been happy in such a long time. Their little moment together was interrupted by a woman wishing to purchase a book. He tore his gaze away, shook his head, and held up one finger as he excused himself. Crystal walked around the shop, glancing briefly every so often at the old shop owner. He certainly seemed to be taking a sweet time, she thought. She began to walk toward him, but then she stopped and turned around as she thought better of it. She shouldn't be too pushy. So she found a chair and plopped down, chewed her lip, twirled a long lock of hair, and waited. You love books and their shops that much, eh? Crystal spun around and her now dry eyes lit up. The old man had taken a chair next to her. Oh yes, I really do. I'd like to be going to college soon, Mr. Addis, to study literature. She hoped her nose wasn't growing, since this was an outright lie. There was absolutely no way in hell that she was going back to school. She had barely just escaped from that dreadful place. She was surprised at how easily the lie popped out. Do you have a sister, Miss Blue? He asked. Her defensive nature reared up and she narrowed her eyes a fraction. Why? I'm just curious, that's all. Well, oh, yes, okay, I do. Well, what's her name? Her name is Lucy, she lied again. She used her sister's nickname in case she'd done something in the store that had made this unusual little man mad. She really wanted to work here. Did she do something she shouldn't have? Crystal asked. He blinked and it actually looked like his bottom lip quivered. Was his nose starting to turn red? Crystal sighed. Claire must have done something to this poor little old man, and she was going to have to pay the price by leaving and not returning to this wonderful place ever. She stood up, pulled her knitted cap down over her hair, and moved towards the front door. I'm very sorry to have taken up your time. Wait! He jumped up from his chair. No, come back here, young lady. She turned around and watched him approach her with his arm outstretched, wearing a look of, well, she supposed, a look of regret, like he didn't want her to go. What a funny old man, she thought as she took a few tentative steps back. She was so confused. I'm terribly sorry, the old man said. Forgive me for being such a goose. I'm an old man and your exuberance took me off guard. Did my sister do something to you, Mr. Addis? No, I've never met her. I just asked a silly question. I'm not sure why you just remind me so much of someone. May I ask you another question? She looked at him warily. Sure. She hoped her answer wouldn't make his lip quiver and his nose turn red. May I ask you what your grandparents' names are? It's just that you remind me of someone, and I'm trying to figure out who. Madeline and Pierce Blue, Crystal said. My grandfather, he died 4 years ago, but my grandmother still lives in Albuquerque. Do you know them? Her eyes lit up. If he did, maybe it would help her get the job. No, I don't. Her heart sank. Cosmo gave her a brief smile and nodded curtly. Come with me. He turned away and with an old hand painted with age spots, gestured for her to follow him back to the counter. Desperation kept her from running out the front door, desperation to stay warm and nab the job she'd probably never get, even here with this very odd old man who thought she looked like someone. Cosmo looked at Crystal as he stepped behind the counter. He seemed to have pulled himself together and once again acting normal. Well then, Miss Blue, I believe you could be an asset to my shop. I have just started a project down in my basement that I'd like you to work on. I'll pay you $6.50 an hour to start. If I find you are prompt, reliable, and knowledgeable, I will consider giving you a raise. But you must prove your worth. Is that fair? Even after all that had happened, she was ecstatic. She nodded her head up and down enthusiastically and grabbed Mr. Addis's hand, shaking it vigorously. He was grateful. There was no shock this time. Dude, oh, crikey, sorry, I mean Mr. Addis. Cheers, thank you. Crystal stammered in her excitement. Believe me, you won't be sorry. When should I start? Tomorrow. Starting time is 8:30 a.m. sharp. He handed her a sheet of paper. Fill this out and bring it back tomorrow morning. I don't tolerate tardiness, Miss Blue. My partner, Adam, will let you in. Now run along. I'm a very busy man. She shook his hand again and started for the front door. She turned around as she drew her scarf around her neck. Is there a cafe or a restaurant close? I'm mad with starvation. The old man's eyes widened. Mad with starvation, he thought. She certainly was a dramatic little thing. He motioned with his hand to the right. I believe there's a coffee shop just down the way. I hear they have good soup. With a skip in her step, she flew out the front door. A good bowl of soup and a blazing hot cup of coffee would be welcomed on this blistery day in the north. She headed down the frozen sidewalk in the direction the old man had pointed and suddenly stopped. She had no idea what the name of the bookstore was. She turned back and read the words painted on the window of the door she'd tried to read earlier. Before, she had sworn the letters had seemed quite small and unimpressive and had been hard to read, but now they were large and bold and artistically painted in blues and shades of gold. They rested within the pages of a large book painted on the door's window. She raised her eyebrows and shivered. "The blue crystal," she whispered. The name of the store was almost identical to hers. No wonder the old man had looked at her so oddly. She furrowed her brow when she noticed the store's exterior lights. She could have sworn they'd looked different before. The lamp's bright light had spilled out the entryway, and the modern fixtures blended unobtrusively into the brick exterior. And the door wasn't purple, it was dark brown. "Bloody freaky," she mumbled as she turned away. Her stomach growled and she shook her head as she headed down the sidewalk. She looked back once more and shook off her imaginings, blaming it on being cold and half blind. Cosmo, watching her from the shop window. "You hopeful old man," he thought, shaking his head and wiping his tired eyes. He was too old for this. He was still reeling from the shock of her actually standing there in front of him, and he was still a bit woozy from the electric shock from her handshake. What had that been all about? It had almost made him keel over. His dear departed wife had told him that this day might happen. He closed his eyes, and his favorite image of his wife Dolores floated before him. "Oh, this is Mr. E." Her clear blue eyes snapped, and the wind caught her soft brown hair and blew it gently across her face as she laughed into the wind. He smiled. That particular trip to Cape Cod had been spectacular. Cosmo thought of the young girl, and his heart leapt. She reminded him of another young woman who he'd comforted more than 15 years ago, as she cried out her heart to him. Their beautiful honey-brown cat-like eyes were identical. But it couldn't be her, he thought. His old disbelieving heart shouldn't allow him to trust a hope. Yet her presence had begun to give him a feeling of déjà vu. And her name. He'd almost choked when she'd said her name. He loved the name of his bookstore because it reminded him of a little girl he'd once known, Crystal, his brother's granddaughter, who had died in a fire along with the rest of her family. The bookstore had the name long before he'd bought it. Earlier, when he'd taken a little extra time with the female customer, he'd watched her. He hadn't had feelings like this in years. She had him a little flustered, first her appearance, then her enthusiasm, finally her tears. But her sisters' and grandparents' names weren't the ones he'd hoped to hear. He should have known, shouldn't have gotten his hopes up. He'd looked her over as he'd slowly walked back to where she had taken a seat in the front of his shop. He'd watched her twirl her long lock of black hair. He'd seen this style many times before, worn by various students who'd wandered through his shop, and he'd presumed they were potheads or derelicts, as the dreadlocks appeared quite messy. Hers, on the other hand, were tidy and so artfully done, there seemed almost, cheerful, and he thought quite attractive. He'd never understood why anyone would let their hair get into this state, but when Crystal had leaned against the counter and spoken so close to him, he'd eyed the locks up close and had realized there was a practical art to this style. Her locks were anything but random and messy. And as he'd approached her and watched her twirl her hair, he saw her throw or chew her bottom lip nervously. That act had softened him up even more. She was young, probably 17 or 18, making her age about right. She was very tall, almost regal, just like, he thought, maybe her presence around the shop would be the therapeutic for his old soul, even if she did look like she'd just come straight from Woodstock. He considered her voice. It had a sing-song quality to it. Certain words she softened slightly, and others were clipped short. When she'd mentioned the name of the town and the bookstore she'd gone to on the weekends with her grandfather, the words had come naturally, like she'd spoken them often. He couldn't remember the name of the town, but she had called the bookstore the Fin Shigar. He shook his head, struggling to place her accent. He knew he'd been brusque with the girl, but she'd caught him off guard. He snorted. Nobody had ever called him dude, at least not to his face. All the young college kids who came into his shop steered clear of him. She certainly wasn't afraid of him, though. He shook his head. smiled. She was like a ray of sunshine in his lonely life. He remembered when she'd put her hat back on. Sorry, it's hard to see. I'm reading in the sunshine. He remembered when she'd put her hat back on, pulling it gracefully over her thick head of hair. He'd been afraid she would leave. That's when he decided he wanted her around. And so he had surprised himself. He had given her the job he was holding for his grandson Daniel. His brother's letter that had come with the shipment of books had said he would need to hire a relative for this particular job. But that, for heaven's sake, excuse me, for this particular job. But it was his store and he could do anything he wanted. In all probability, she wasn't who he thought she was, but an old man could hope. Couldn't he? She certainly was a persistent little thing, he thought with a grin. With a glint in his eye that hadn't been there in years, he made his way back to the counter, then to his office in search of his pipe. Dude, he shook his head and laughed as he closed the door softly behind him. So, my friends, that is the end of chapter 1. And it has been a delight to sit in the morning sunshine and read to you to finish chapter 1 in Illuminating Crystal. So I bid you good day, and I hope that you all play well together, that you subscribe to my channel if you so choose, and you hit the like button, and please leave a comment. Anything you would like to share with me today. I read them all when they do come in, and I hope that when you meet someone today out in the world, you give them a happy smile and or a nod. They need your acknowledgement, and I acknowledge you. Namaste. And as always, when I can't see in the sunshine, I can't find the button, but I found it.